In the 1970s, people, especially women in Santa Cruz, California, were in a state of panic. Towering over 6'9" tall and weighing 300 pounds at the time of the attack, he committed heinous crimes, however displayed a very humble personality, the kind of person you would get along with over a cup of coffee. But who would have guessed a man like him would be responsible for 10 lives, including his paternal grandparents and biological mother? Edmund Kemper, aka Big Ed, was born in Burbank, California on the 18th of December 1948. He was the second of 3 children, and Ed was the only boy. He had a traumatic childhood and often felt unwanted and lonely. There were regular arguments in the house between Edward's mother, Clonel Stage, and his father, Edmund II. Eventually, they divorced in 1957 when Ed was just 9 years old. This was very tough for him as he idolized and loved his dad. He was sent to live with his mother, who disliked him as he very much resembled his father. Clonel would belittle him, make fun of his height and personality. Ed displayed aggressive, violent behaviors from a young age. He would often take his sister's dolls and decapitate their head. In 2nd grade, he developed an obsession with his teacher, so he began stalking her, following her back home. But what was incredibly weird was that he was carrying a knife all along. Around the age of 9 or 8 years old, Ed went to a magic show, and the magician picked a volunteer from the crowd to come up to the stage and participate in a head-chopping trick. This had a very big impact on Ed as he got very excited and felt the magician was in control. He admired that, and it was this event which introduced him to the idea of decapitation. At the age of 15, Ed was already 6'4" and after being passed between parents, he started to live with his grandparents, Maud and Edmund I, on their farm in the mountains of Norfolk, California. His grandmother was just like Ed's mum. Not only was she mean and controlling, but continued to abuse Ed. His grandfather gave him a .22 caliber gun to kill rabbits and gophers. However, he used it to kill other animals such as birds. Eventually, his grandparents realized this behavior and had growing concerns for him. With time, Ed's rage continued to grow. On the 27th of August 1964, his grandmother was sat on the kitchen table. 15-year-old Ed then picked up his grandfather's rifle and shot her in the back of her head. She passed away instantly, but Ed proceeded to shoot her twice more in the back. He then wrapped her head in a towel and dragged her lifeless body to her bedroom. Not long after, his grandfather returned from the grocery store. Although Ed developed a good relationship with him, but he was scared that he would be caught and punished, so thought he had no choice but to shoot his grandfather in the back as he was unloading the groceries from the car. After Ed had calmed down slightly, he realized what he had done, so called his mother and confessed. She told him to call the police and to hand himself in, which he did. When the police questioned why he killed his grandparents, he said, quote, "to see what it felt like." After a number of tests, a psychiatrist deemed Ed mentally ill and suggested he should be treated instead of punished. He was in turn sent to a maximum security facility for mentally ill convicts, Atascadero State Hospital. Ed was a model patient and he was very intelligent with an IQ of 140 and he passed all of his tests. Staffs were highly impressed with his behavior and soon Ed was their helper too, even allowing him to help administer tests to other patients. This resulted in him being discharged and returned to live with his mother in 1969 at the age of just 21 years old. In 1971, he was employed by the Department of Transportation. However, he really wanted to become a police officer. He was rejected because he was over the maximum height requirement. This had a negative impact on him, and living at home with his mother only made matters worse. She consistently told him how worthless he was and that he would never find a girlfriend. By this point, he was extremely scared of failing at relationships and came to a realization that the only way for him to get a woman was to kidnap them. As the arguments with his mother continued, his rage built. Needing a way to release his anger, his murder spree began. In the spring of 1972, Ed began picking up female hitchhikers. It was the 7th of May 1972 when Ed picked up 2 students in Berkeley. Anita Leicester and Mary Ann Pierce were 2 18-year-old girls making their way to Stanford University. Unfortunately, they would never make it to their destination. Ed drove them to a secluded area before he handcuffed Mary and locked Anita in the trunk, then stabbed and strangled them both. After which he placed both bodies in the boot and drove home. On his way home, he was stopped by a police officer because he had a broken tail light. The police officer then looked around his car. Ed then asked them if they wanted to open the boot. If the officer had said yes, he would be fully prepared to take him out. Instead, the officer was grateful for Ed's cooperation, so said there was no need and then drove off. After taking the bodies home, he photographed them and conducted necrophilia with their decapitated heads. After which he dismembered them, putting the body parts into plastic bags and disposed them near Loma Prieta Mountain. On the 14th of September 1972, 15-year-old hitchhiker Aiko Q was late to her dance class as she missed her usual bus. So she got on Ed's car and again he drove her to a secluded area where he took out his gun. This immediately frightened her, but Ed didn't want to make his victim feel like they are in danger and about to die, so he tried his best to calm her down by putting his gun away. At one point, he even managed to lock himself out of the car, leaving Aiko and the gun inside. However, with his charm, he managed to gain her trust and talked her into letting him back into the car. As soon as he did, he choked her unconscious with her scarf, raped, then killed her. Just like his previous victims, Ed took her back home, where he decapitated her and performed necrophilia with it. He then dismembered and disposed her body. His 4th victim was 18-year-old Cindy Shaw, who got into his car on the 7th of January 1973, where she was shot and suffered the same fate as his previous victims. He kept her decapitated head for several days, then buried it in his garden, looking up at his mother's bedroom. His reasoning for this was because his mum always wanted people to look up to her, so he decided to make a joke out of it. On the 5th of February 1973, 23-year-old Rosaline Thorpe was quick to jump into Ed's car when he offered her a ride. However, her 20-year-old friend Alice Lee didn't feel comfortable with the idea of getting into a stranger's car. But after Ed strongly persuaded her, she hesitantly got into his car. Little did they know it would be the last ride they would ever take. By now, Ed was more confident and experienced. He shot both women and wrapped their bodies in blankets. Again, they were placed at the back of his car, and on his way back home, he was stopped by 2 guards outside the guard office on campus. They were searching all passing cars, and the guards wanted to check Ed's car, but he managed to stare them out and they backed off immediately, letting Ed pass without searching his vehicle. Once again, luck was on his side and he got away with it. He resisted to kill for 2 months, but fights with his mother had reached its peak and he said, quote, "It's not going to happen to any more girls. This has to stay between me and my mother." On the night of the 20th of April 1973, drunk Connell returned home after a night out. The commotion woke Ed up, so he walked to her bedroom where she sarcastically said, quote, "I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk." Ed quickly responded by saying no, followed by good night. Then he went back to his room, nothing too out of the ordinary. Then a few hours later, around 4 in the morning, he walked to his mother's room, opened her door and then hammered her to death as she slept. The hatred towards his mum didn't stop there. He went on to humiliate her corpse further. by performing unspeakable acts on her and her decapitated head. He then spent hours throwing darts and shouting at her blood-dripping, severed head. Once he was done shouting at her lifeless body, he then cut out her tongue and vocal cords, then proceeded to dispose it. When the garbage disposal couldn't dispose her vocal cords completely, as it had popped back up into the sink, he found this hilarious, saying it was because of his mother's excessive gossiping when she was alive. Next thing he did was to call his mother's best friend, 59-year-old Sally Hallett, and invited her over for dinner. Once she arrived, he punched her in the stomach, then strangled her until he heard her neck crack. Ed then spent the night with Sally's corpse, performing unspeakable acts on her. The next morning, he realized what he had done, and in a complete panic, he left town. He got as far as Colorado before he couldn't take it anymore and turned himself in. He called the Santa Cruz police. Soon after, Ed was arrested on the 24th of April 1973. The detectives were surprised at his willingness to cooperate and ability to recall trivial details of his crimes. The trial began on the 23rd of October 1973. 24-year-old Ed at the time was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. Because of his previous confessions, Ed tried the insanity defense. He took to the stand to detail what he had done, showing no remorse in the hope the juries would find him insane. Instead, in November of the same year, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Special agents John Douglas and Bob Rustler started a revolutionary study into the behavior of murderers, and Ed had a huge part in this. By making him feel important and in charge, Ed gave information on how murderers think and behave. His interviews provided the FBI new behavioral science units with information that would be very useful in the years to come. I've compiled a video to include Ed Kemper's interviews in chronological order since 1981, so if you're interested in watching that, I'll link it in the description down below. Ed Kemper's killing spree ruined and destroyed many lives. His willingness to help the law enforcement by giving them a clear insight into his thought process, which can be used as a backbone to capture criminals with the same intention, is very useful. Thank you so much for watching. Please do consider subscribing. Click here to watch another video, and please do stay safe and stay alert out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.